Tonight, we are going to follow one of history's most unlikely career changes. A frightened collection of refugees hiding in wet mud among reeds and mosquitoes somehow turned themselves into the polished merchants, admirals, diplomats, and mildly smug sea lords of Venice. It is the sort of transformation that should not have worked, rather like deciding to build a global financial and naval power in a place that was barely convenient for standing upright. And yet it did work, which is rude to common sense but very satisfying for us. So, settle in, let your shoulders unclench, and let the water of the Venetian lagoon go flat and silver in your mind. And, very quietly, almost apologetically, remember to press sub if you enjoy this kind of sleepy history. No pressure. Venice would probably turn it into a tax eventually. Now, to understand how Venice rose, we have to begin not with triumph, bells, marbled palaces, and elegant gondolas, but with collapse, fear, and mud. Quite a lot of mud. In the later days of the Western Roman Empire, northern Italy was not the peaceful postcard region people imagine when they think of wine, sunlight, and neatly dressed tourists trying not to drop gelato on themselves. It was a frontier of stress. Imperial power was weakening. Armies came and went. Administrative structures still existed, but they were fraying. The old Roman road system and urban network were still there. The cities still stood, and people still clung to the reassuring fiction that civilization would continue more or less as usual, perhaps with a few barbarian inconveniences. But the 5th and 6th centuries had a habit of ruining such optimism. First came the shocks that broke Roman political control in the West. Then came the Ostrogoths. Then the Byzantine reconquest under Emperor Justinian, which was supposed to restore Roman order and instead help turn Italy into a battlefield. Then, just when anyone still alive might have hoped for one uneventful decade, the Lombards arrived in 568 and began taking large parts of northern Italy. At this point, if you were living in a respectable mainland town in the Veneto region, you may have started looking at the coastal marshes with new appreciation. They were damp, inconvenient, and full of birds who seemed to object to your presence, but they also had one crucial advantage. Invading cavalry hated them. That is how the story begins, not with a grand plan, but with retreat. People from Roman towns such as Aquileia, Altinum, Padua, Oderzo, and other communities of the mainland fled or gradually shifted toward the lagoon islands. Some may already have had seasonal or commercial connections there. The lagoon was not empty wilderness waiting for destiny. Fishermen, salt workers, boatmen, and small settlements already existed in these watery margins. But the refugee waves changed the scale and the meaning of life there. The lagoon became not just a workplace, not just a temporary hideout, but a home. A strange home, admittedly. It was a region of shallow channels, mud flats, sandbanks, reeds, shifting tides, brackish water, and islands that did not exactly inspire imperial confidence. Nothing about it said future maritime superpower. It said, at best, temporary inconvenience. It said, you may survive here, but you will probably never dry completely. And yet the lagoon had hidden strengths it was hard to invade. That mattered. Armies designed for roads and open fields did not move elegantly through a maze of tidal channels. Horses were less useful. Heavy equipment became awkward. Local knowledge became everything. If you knew the waters, the channels, the safe passages, and the rhythm of the tides, you could move. If you did not, you were merely a confused outsider splashing in expensive armor. For refugees who had lost the security of the mainland, the lagoon offered a defensive world created by geography itself. It was not comfortable, but comfort was not the first priority. Staying alive was. Life in those early lagoon communities was not glamorous. We should be honest about that in the same way one should be honest about medieval dentistry. The refugees had not moved into a ready-made city of marble arcades and artistic genius. They settled among low islands where land was unstable, building materials were not always abundant on site, and fresh water was a recurring issue. The environment had to be negotiated constantly. Houses needed foundations in uncertain ground. Transport depended on boats. Food came from fishing, trade, small-scale cultivation where possible, and links to the mainland when conditions allowed. Salt production became important. So did timber imported from inland regions. Daily existence required patience, adaptation, and the willingness to treat mud as a permanent business partner. If a modern city dweller complains when the Wi-Fi slows down, early Venetians might have suggested that at least the ground under their apartment was not trying to dissolve. Still, the lagoon did not merely shelter people. It shaped them. That is one of the great themes of Venetian history. Geography did not determine everything, but it imposed a discipline. Communities that survived there learned to rely on maritime movement, local cooperation, engineering improvisation, and trade connections. They had to think in terms of water routes rather than roads, harbors rather than gates, vessels rather than carts. The sea was not a distant horizon. It was the street, the field, the wall, the highway, and the opportunity. Over time, this produced a society that was neither fully of the mainland nor simply of the open sea, but of the in-between world of lagoon and Adriatic. Venice grew in a place that forced people to become practical, flexible, and slightly obsessed with things floating correctly. At first, the lagoon settlements remained tied to the surviving structures of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. This is a detail modern retelling sometimes glide past because later Venice became so proudly itself. But in its early centuries, Venice was not born as a clear independent nation-state with a lion flag and an attitude. It developed within the Byzantine sphere. After Justinian's reconquest, parts of Italy remained under imperial control from Constantinople, including coastal zones and centers such as Ravenna. The lagoon communities fell under this wider Byzantine political and military world. Imperial officials, military commands, church structures, and legal traditions all mattered. Even the title of Doge, later so iconic and Venetian, derived from the Latin dux, meaning leader, connected to Roman and Byzantine administrative language. Venice's beginnings were messy, local, and adaptive, but they were not isolated. The city was learning from empire even while empire was struggling to hold itself together. This Byzantine connection turned out to be immensely valuable. Constantinople was one of the great cities of the medieval world, fabulously wealthy by contemporary standards, a center of administration, craftsmanship, diplomacy, and trade. To be linked to that world was to be connected to systems of exchange and political legitimacy much larger than the scattered lagoon communities themselves. Venice could act as a frontier outpost, a maritime intermediary, and a useful partner. While inland Italy fragmented under the pressures of Lombard conquest and post-Roman instability, the lagoon communities retained these eastern ties. That helped them survive and gradually prosper. They were not merely hiding from chaos. They were positioning themselves between worlds. One of the most important patterns in Venetian history is that whenever larger powers clashed, Venice tried very hard not to be crushed between them and, if possible, to make a profit from the arrangement. This tendency appears early. The lagoon communities sat between Lombard-controlled mainland territories and Byzantine-controlled coastal and maritime systems. Their survival depended on balancing those relationships. On one hand, they needed access to mainland resources, grain, timber, livestock, labor, and trade. On the other hand, they benefited from imperial protection and maritime commerce. They could not simply retreat into a self-sufficient swamp and call it a day. They had to mediate, bargain, transport, and adapt. In other words, even before Venice became famous for diplomacy, it was already practicing the art of being useful to multiple sides while remaining as independent as circumstances allowed. This would later become one of the city's most refined talents, almost a civic hobby. As the 7th and 8th centuries unfolded, the lagoon settlements became more organized. The traditional date of 697 is sometimes given for the election of the first Doge, though historians are cautious about taking later Venetian traditions entirely at face value. Venice loved history, but it loved dignified origin stories even more. Still, some form of increasingly coordinated leadership did emerge. The scattered communities needed governance, especially for defense, taxation, justice, and trade regulation. Over time, political authority centered more clearly in the lagoon rather than being imposed directly from outside. This did not mean immediate independence from Byzantium, but it did mean growing local coherence. Venice was becoming a polity, not just a refuge. Political development in Venice was never as simple as one heroic founder leading everyone into glory while inspirational music swelled in the background. It was more collective, more contested, and much more administrative. Power shifted among families, islands, clerical institutions, and political factions. The early seat of leadership moved, and different centers within the lagoon competed for prominence. One significant turning point came with the rise of Rialto, the cluster of islands that would become the urban and symbolic core of Venice. Rialto offered advantages of defensibility and access. In 810, when the Frankish king Pepin, son of Charlemagne, attacked the lagoon during broader struggles between the Franks and Byzantines, the Venetians successfully resisted. Their knowledge of the lagoon and naval mobility mattered. The survival of the community under this pressure reinforced the importance of the lagoon's central islands. Soon after, the seat of ducal power settled more firmly at Rialto. Future Venice was beginning to gather itself. That Frankish episode deserves a moment because it highlights a larger truth. Venice survived not because it was stronger than everyone else in direct confrontation, but because its environment and habits made it hard to conquer. A mainland power could be rich, organized, and militarily formidable, yet still find the lagoon maddening. To subdue Venice, an enemy needed not just soldiers, but maritime skill, local knowledge, and sustained logistical capacity. This protective awkwardness gave the city time. Time to organize institutions, time to develop shipping, time to turn survival into wealth. History often rewards places that can simply avoid being destroyed long enough to get their affairs in order. Venice was very good at not being conveniently destroyable. In 828 came one of the most famous episodes in Venetian self-fashioning, the acquisition of the relics of Saint Mark the Evangelist from Alexandria. According to the celebrated story, Venetian merchants smuggled the saint's remains out of Muslim-controlled Egypt by hiding them under pork, relying on the idea that customs inspectors would not be eager to poke around. It is a very Venetian legend, pious, clever, practical, commercial, and just slightly cheeky. Whether embellished or not, the event mattered enormously. Saint Mark became the patron saint of Venice, replacing the earlier patron Saint Theodore, and the Lion of Saint Mark became the city's lasting emblem. Relics were not merely devotional objects. They conferred prestige, sacred legitimacy, pilgrimage appeal, and political symbolism. By securing Saint Mark, Venice proclaimed that it was no longer just a peripheral lagoon settlement surviving on fish and determination. It was a city chosen for greatness, or at least willing to commission architecture suggesting that it had been. The Basilica of St. Mark, built and rebuilt over time, became the visual expression of this ambition. Its style drew heavily on Byzantine models, especially the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. This was no accident. Venice wanted to present itself as a city of Eastern Christian magnificence while also cultivating its own distinct identity. Gold mosaics, domes, exotic materials, and imported treasures turned St. Mark's into a public statement that Venice occupied a privileged place between East and West. Even in stone, or rather brick and marble veneer, Venice was practicing appropriation as a fine art. The city took influences from elsewhere, adapted them, and then wore them so confidently that later generations assumed the look had been Venetian all along. While the city was building this symbolic identity, its economic foundation was strengthening. Geography again mattered. Venice sat at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea, connected by waterways to the eastern Mediterranean and by trade routes to the Po Valley and beyond. It could act as a gateway between the Byzantine and Islamic worlds on one side and the markets of Central and Western Europe on the other. Goods moved through Venice because Venice made movement possible. Salt from the lagoon could be exported, timber, slaves, metals, cloth, grain, spices, wine, wax, and luxury goods all circulated through its merchants' hands. Venice did not initially dominate Mediterranean trade, but it inserted itself skillfully into existing networks. It was less like a giant inventing commerce and more like an especially alert person showing up early to the market, securing the best stall, and quietly charging everyone passing through. Salt, often overlooked because it is not glamorous enough for epic poems, was crucial. In a pre-modern world, salt preserved food, sustained armies, and underpinned economic systems. Control of salt production and trade could be a serious source of wealth and leverage. The lagoon environment was suited to salt works, and the Venetians understood how to profit from that. Salt connected the city to regional exchanges and gave it a commodity that mattered in everyday life across vast areas. Venice's greatness would later be draped in silk and spice, but part of it rested on something much simpler: the business of keeping fish edible. Venetian merchants were active not only in the Adriatic, but increasingly across the eastern Mediterranean. They traveled to Byzantine ports, to North Africa, and to Levantine markets. This meant navigating a world that was politically complex and religiously diverse. The Mediterranean, after the rise of Islam, was not a sealed frontier between Christians and Muslims, despite later rhetoric and occasional warfare. It was also a space of exchange. Muslim merchants, Byzantine officials, Jewish traders, Latin Christians, and many others interacted commercially. Venice thrived because it was willing to conduct business across these lines. Moral posturing could be reserved for ceremonial occasions. In actual practice, profit encouraged flexibility. Venetian merchants were perfectly capable of being devout Christians and hard-headed pragmatists in the same transaction. That said, this world was not peaceful. The Adriatic and Mediterranean were also spaces of piracy, raiding, and naval rivalry. The Venetians learned early that commerce required protection. Merchant shipping and military capacity could not be separated for long. Convoys, armed vessels, and state-backed maritime policy became increasingly important. The doges and governing elites understood that trade alone was not enough. The sea lanes had to be secured. This realization laid the groundwork for Venice's later naval strength. The city did not become a sea power because it loved dramatic battles for their own sake. It became one because merchants do not enjoy being robbed, and insurance premiums were not yet a comforting modern spreadsheet. A decisive stage in Venetian development came through its relationship with Byzantium. In 992, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II granted Venetian merchants significant trading privileges within the empire. This was a major advantage. Reduced duties and official favor enhanced Venice's ability to operate in Byzantine markets and compete with rivals. It was one of those moments in history when political service translated into economic opportunity. Venice had assisted Byzantine naval efforts against common enemies, especially in the Adriatic. In return, it received privileges that could be converted into wealth. The arrangement benefited both sides, though, as history would prove, Venice was very good at turning privileges into permanent structural advantage. The Adriatic itself was a central arena. Control over this sea was essential to Venice's security and expansion. The eastern Adriatic coast, including Dalmatian towns, was contested by local powers, Slavic groups, pirates, and larger empires. Venetian doges mounted campaigns to secure maritime routes and assert influence. In 1000, Doge Pietro II Orseolo led an expedition along the Dalmatian coast that later Venetian memory treated as a foundational triumph. The details are more complicated than patriotic ceremonies suggested, but the broad point stands. Venice was no longer merely defending its lagoon. It was projecting power outward across the Adriatic. That shift matters immensely. A refuge was becoming a regional actor. The marriage between commerce and power deepened. Venetian elites were merchants, but they were not merchants in the modern sense of private individuals operating entirely apart from the state. In Venice, state and commerce intertwined. The leading families who governed the Republic also profited from its maritime expansion. Public policy supported commercial interests, and commercial success strengthened public institutions. This symbiosis was one of Venice's secret engines. Unlike kingdoms where aristocrats sometimes despised trade as beneath their dignity, Venice developed a ruling class that treated trade as the basis of dignity. They could be noble and deeply interested in shipping manifests at the same time. It is hard to overstate how powerful that combination was. As the city grew richer, its institutions became more elaborate. Venice is famous for its republican system, though that word should be handled carefully. It was not a democracy in any modern sense. Ordinary people were not wandering into St. Mark's Square to vote on tariff policy after lunch. Venetian government was an oligarchic republic dominated by elite families. Yet compared with hereditary monarchies, it did have collective and institutional features that contributed to stability. The Doge, though prestigious, was not an absolute ruler. Councils, assemblies, magistracies, and advisory bodies limited power. Over time, Venice became increasingly suspicious of any individual becoming too dominant. This was not pure civic virtue. It was also self-interest among the elite, who preferred not to be ruled by one of their own. Still, the effect was important. Venetian politics tended toward continuity, negotiation, and bureaucratic restraint. It was one of the few places in medieval Europe where paperwork could be quietly more powerful than personal heroics. This political culture helped Venice survive succession crises and external threats better than many neighbors. A king's death elsewhere might mean civil war, dynastic disputes, and several years of energetic misery. In Venice, leadership was embedded in institutions. There were still conspiracies, rivalries, and family feuds because humans remained humans, and rich humans especially enjoy rivalry. But the system encouraged managed conflict. Stability reassured merchants. Merchants funded the state. The state protected trade. Trade enriched the elite. The elite reinforced the institutions. It was, from their perspective, a beautifully efficient circle. Religion also shaped Venetian identity, though again in a particularly Venetian way. The city was Christian, deeply and publicly so, with churches, relics, festivals, liturgy, and sacred symbolism woven into civic life. But Venice often treated religion as part of statecraft rather than something separate from it. The translation of St. Mark's relics, the ceremonial pageantry of the Doge, the iconography of the lion, the blessings of fleets, the close relationship between church and civic authority, these all helped make Venice feel chosen, ordered, and legitimate. The Republic liked to imagine itself under divine favor, which is a comforting thought when much of your city stands on timber piles in tidal mud. Yet Venice was also careful to guard its own autonomy even against the papacy. It respected religion, but it respected Venetian control over Venetian affairs just a little more. During the 11th century, broader Mediterranean changes created new openings. Population and economic growth in Europe increased demand for Eastern luxuries and raw materials. The Byzantine Empire still offered markets and prestige, though it was entering periods of strain. Islamic powers controlled rich commercial regions with goods Europeans wanted. The Crusades, beginning at the end of the century, would further intensify connections between Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, often violently, always lucratively for someone. Venice was ideally placed to profit from this rearranged world. It had ships, sailors, merchants, political stability, and a culture already comfortable operating across religious and cultural boundaries. While others saw the sea as danger, Venice saw invoice potential. The First Crusade, launched in 1095, transformed Mediterranean politics, though not always in the ways its preachers promised. For Venice, the crusading era brought opportunities to expand trade privileges and strategic influence in the Levant. Transporting crusaders, supplying fleets, and supporting military campaigns could all be monetized. Venetian merchants obtained quarters in cities, exemptions from tolls, warehouses, and legal advantages. Wherever Latin Christian conquest opened ports, Venice aimed to secure a foothold. This was not entirely cynical. Venetians could genuinely support crusading ideals. But they had the admirable ability to blend spiritual enthusiasm with detailed commercial clauses. Their competitors understood this perfectly because Venice was not alone. Amalfi, Pisa, and Genoa were also maritime republics and trading powers with ambitions in the Mediterranean. Among them, Venice eventually proved especially resilient and successful, but the competition was fierce. These cities fought, negotiated, undercut one another, and scrambled for privileges from emperors, kings, caliphs, crusader princes, and anyone else holding a useful port. Mediterranean trade was not a gentlemanly exchange of pleasantries. It was a brutal, shifting contest conducted with contracts, galleys, diplomacy, bribery, and occasional armed enthusiasm. Venice's rise cannot be understood without seeing it as part of this competitive environment. It won not because destiny handed it a crown, but because it maneuvered better than many rivals over a very long time. Part of Venice's edge lay in shipbuilding and naval organization. The Venetian galley became a central instrument of trade and war. Long relatively fast and suitable for Mediterranean conditions, galleys could be used for commercial transport, combat, escort, and communication. Venice developed expertise in constructing, maintaining, and deploying fleets. This would later culminate in the famous arsenal, one of the greatest shipbuilding complexes of the medieval and early modern world. Even before the arsenal reached its mature scale, the culture of organized maritime production was taking shape. Venice understood logistics. It understood that sea power depended not just on brave captains, but on timber supply, rope, iron, oars, dockyards, labor systems, and administrative planning. It is less poetic than a naval epic, but far more effective. The city itself changed as wealth increased. Timber piles were driven into the soft ground. Buildings rose, churches multiplied, markets expanded. Bridges linked islands. Quays and canals supported denser traffic. Imported stone and decorative materials transformed the appearance of key spaces. Venice did not conquer its environment by eliminating it. Instead, it learned to build with it, over it, and through it. The city remained amphibious in spirit. Water continued to define movement, defense, and atmosphere, but it became a built environment of astonishing sophistication. Foreign visitors would later marvel that such a city existed at all. This reaction is understandable. Even now, Venice feels slightly improbable, like a dream someone continued constructing long after waking up should have intervened. Socially, Venice also developed a distinct character. It was urban, commercial, and outward-facing. Noble status increasingly intertwined with service to the state and participation in trade. A rigid hereditary aristocracy would emerge more clearly later, but even early on, leading families gained influence through wealth, office holding, and strategic marriage networks. The city attracted artisans, sailors, clerics, merchants, laborers, and migrants from many regions. It was cosmopolitan by medieval standards. Languages, customs, and goods from different worlds mingled there. Venice's identity was local and proud, but it was nourished by exchange. The city did not seal itself off. It fed on connections. Of course, this wealth rested on labor that was not always gentle or free. Sailors rowed galleys under harsh conditions. Porters hauled cargo. Craftsmen worked long hours. Slavery and slave trading existed within Venetian commerce, as they did widely in the medieval Mediterranean. Captives, servants, and coerced labor formed part of the system. Romantic visions of Venice as pure beauty and refined diplomacy tend to overlook these harder edges. The Republic was successful, but not morally innocent. Few powerful states are. Venice's rise involved resilience and ingenuity, yes, but also exploitation, coercion, and relentless pursuit of advantage. It is still an excellent bedtime story, just not a naive one. The relationship with Byzantium gradually became more complicated as Venetian power increased. At first, the empire had been patron, protector, and gateway, but success changes relationships. A junior partner who becomes wealthy, armed, and strategically indispensable may begin to feel less junior. Likewise, the senior partner may become suspicious. Byzantine emperors valued Venetian naval help and commercial services, but they also worried about conceding too much. Venetian merchants inside the empire could seem useful or parasitic, depending on the day and the customs revenue figures. Meanwhile, Venetian identity itself became more self-conscious. The city still drew from Byzantine culture, but it no longer saw itself merely as an outpost of imperial order. It was becoming something separate, a republic with its own ambitions, symbols, and interests. This tension would sharpen dramatically in the 12th century. One notable crisis came in 1171, when Emperor Manuel I Komnenos ordered the arrest of Venetians in Byzantine territory and confiscation of their property. The exact motives remained debated, but resentment of Venetian privilege was certainly part of it. For Venice, the shock was severe. It revealed the danger of depending too heavily on imperial favor. If your commercial empire rests on privileges, another ruler can revoke. Your prosperity is not entirely your own. The Venetians responded with anger and military preparation, though their expedition fared badly. The episode left scars. Trust between Venice and Byzantium weakened. Later events would turn that weakening into catastrophe. But before we arrive there, it is worth pausing to notice how extraordinary Venice's rise already was by this point. In a few centuries, the lagoon settlements had gone from refuge communities at the edge of collapsing Roman order to a wealthy maritime republic with fleets, institutions, sacred prestige, international trade connections, and influence across the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. No single miracle explains it, rather a combination of geography, political flexibility, Byzantine links, commercial aggression, maritime skill, and institutional stability, gradually compounded over generations. Venice did not rise overnight. It accreted power, like silt, building an island. Very lucrative silt. The city's rituals increasingly reflected its confidence. The Doge's public ceremonies, diplomatic receptions, and festive processions presented Venice as orderly, prosperous, and favored by God. One famous expression of this maritime identity was the symbolic marriage of the sea, later formalized in grand ritual, in which the Doge cast a ring into the water to signify Venice's dominion. The ceremony was theatrical, yes, but theatrics matter in politics. Venice performed power for itself and for outsiders. It said, in effect, we are not a strange accident on mud banks. We are the rightful bridegroom of the sea. Admittedly, the sea had not signed the paperwork, but symbolism rarely waits for consent. Venetian diplomacy also matured. The Republic sent envoys, negotiated treaties, secured exemptions, and played larger powers against one another with increasing sophistication. Here again, the city's origins mattered. A community born in insecurity learned early to survive by reading circumstances carefully. Venice could be flexible, patient, and calculating. It often preferred contracts to conquest when contracts were cheaper, though it was not shy about force when needed. This combination made it formidable. Other states might win spectacular victories and then lose them through poor administration. Venice, by contrast, loved the slow, cumulative victory of legal privilege, monopoly rights, harbor access, and favorable toll schedules. It could turn a paragraph in a treaty into a generation of wealth. At home, one of the great questions of Venetian politics was how to prevent the state from becoming prey to factional chaos or personal tyranny. The answer emerged gradually through a dense web of councils and magistracies. The Doge's power was circumscribed. Oaths limited his actions. Advisory councils surrounded him. Collective governance became a habit. This did not eliminate corruption or ambition. It simply distributed them more efficiently. But that mattered. Venice avoided some of the worst disruptions that plagued Italian communes and feudal monarchies. Stability became part of its brand. A merchant considering where to invest goods and capital might reasonably prefer the city where the government was still likely to exist next month. Venice also benefited from the relative weakness or fragmentation of many surrounding powers. The Holy Roman Empire had interests in Italy, but could not easily dominate the lagoon. The papacy had spiritual authority, but lacked direct control. The Byzantine Empire was powerful, yet distant, and increasingly troubled. Local rulers on the Adriatic coast were divided. Islamic powers in the Mediterranean were varied and not always coordinated against Italian merchants. Crusader states needed naval assistance. In short, the world around Venice was competitive but fractured. This created room for a nimble maritime republic to insert itself. Had the Mediterranean been controlled by one overwhelmingly dominant stable empire from end to end, Venice might have remained a regional curiosity. Instead, it found opportunity in the cracks. The 12th century saw Venice expand commercially in the Levant, North Africa, and beyond. Merchant colonies established themselves in key ports. Venetian fondaci, warehouses, and trading enclaves helped structure foreign commerce. Networks of credit, partnership, and family firms supported long-distance trade. Maritime law, contracts, and notarial culture became increasingly sophisticated. Venice was not only moving goods, it was building systems. Economic scale depends on trust, record-keeping, enforcement, and standardization. The Republic's institutions supported this. It is difficult to become master of the seas if nobody can agree who owes whom for a shipment of pepper. And pepper mattered, as did spices more broadly, along with silk, precious textiles, dyestuffs, sugar, glass, metals, slaves, timber, grain, and countless other goods. Venice's role as an intermediary meant it profited not always by producing the most desired commodities itself, but by controlling movement, redistribution, and finance. This is a classic path to wealth. Middlemen are often mocked right until everyone realizes the entire system depends on them. Venice became one of history's most elegant middlemen. It linked east to west, south to north, producer to consumer, pilgrim to port, crusader to transport, luxury goods to European appetite. It sat in the middle and charged accordingly, Yet the story still retains the texture of improbability because Venice never lost the memory, or at least the usable legend, of its humble origins. That memory was politically useful. A city born from refugees could celebrate resilience, divine favor, and collective effort. It could imagine itself as self-made, though in truth it had borrowed, traded, and appropriated enthusiastically from many worlds. Still, compared with ancient capitals or feudal dynasties, Venice did feel self-created. It had built power where none should have existed. Even its architecture suggested triumph over impossibility. Domes, palaces, quays, and marketplaces rising from pilings driven into mud by generations of labor. It was an urban rebuttal to the phrase, "that will never work." The next great turning point, and in many ways the darkestly brilliant one, lay in the events surrounding the Fourth Crusade. By the end of the 12th century, tensions between Venice and Byzantium had grown. The crusading movement was still redirecting energies and violence eastward. Western European nobles wanted transport to the eastern Mediterranean. Venice, under Doge Enrico Dandolo, entered into agreements to provide ships for a crusading army. When the Crusaders failed to pay the full amount owed, matters became complicated in the distinctive medieval style, meaning that debt, politics, wounded pride, and opportunism began mixing in a barrel and were shaken vigorously. Venice then helped redirect the crusade first to Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic, and eventually toward Constantinople itself. The details are elaborate and famously controversial, involving Byzantine dynastic struggles and layered motivations. But the broad result is beyond doubt. In 1204, Constantinople, the greatest Christian city of the eastern Mediterranean and Venice's former imperial patron, was captured and brutally sacked by the Crusaders. For Venice, this was both astonishing and transformative. A city that had once depended on Byzantine favor now helped tear apart the empire's capital and seized a major share of the spoils. Relics, artworks, treasures, and strategic possessions flowed westward. Venetian influence in former Byzantine territories expanded dramatically. The famous bronze horses that now stand associated with St. Mark's are enduring symbols of this transfer, though even they are part of a longer and somewhat wandering history of appropriation. In one sense, 1204 marks the culmination of Venice's impossible rise. The refugees of the lagoon, or rather their descendants in silks and official robes, had become kingmakers and empire breakers of the Mediterranean. In another sense, it marks the beginning of a new phase entirely, where Venice's maritime empire would deepen, its wealth would soar, and its long rivalry with Genoa and others would define centuries to come. But that belongs fully to the second half of our story. For now, let us pause on the threshold. The water is dark around the lagoon. The timber piles are driven deep. The bells of St. Mark's wait above the square. Ships rock at anchor, carrying wool, grain, timber, wax, silver, relics, gossip, and ambition. Behind the marble and mosaics lies the memory of marshland refuge, of people who fled stronger enemies and settled where horses could not easily follow. They learned tides, they learned trade, they learned how to be useful, how to bargain, how to build on soft ground without apologizing for it. They took imperial privileges, Adriatic campaigns, saintly relics, merchant networks, and institutional caution, and slowly assembled something no one in those first frightened generations could fully have imagined. Not a hideout, not merely a town, a republic of the sea, And in the next part, we will watch that republic become one of the most brilliant, calculating, beautiful, and occasionally alarming powers of the medieval world, as Venice turns maritime skill into empire and proves that, given enough patience, paperwork, and boats, even mud can become magnificent. The Fourth Crusade did not merely hand Venice a convenient pile of loot and a few attractive souvenirs for St. Mark's. It altered the structure of Mediterranean power in a way that favored the Republic for generations. Venice received commercial privileges, quarters in conquered territories, and control or influence over important ports and islands. Crete became one of the great jewels of its overseas empire. Euboea, parts of the Peloponnese, stations in the Aegean, and rights connected to Constantinople itself extended Venetian reach deep into the eastern Mediterranean. The Republic had once lived under Byzantine protection. Now it fed on Byzantine dismemberment with the careful manners of a state that preferred to call such behavior opportunity. In the cold language of strategy, Venice had achieved something astonishing. It had turned a crusading transport contract, unpaid invoices, dynastic intrigue, and general medieval confusion into maritime empire. Not many cities have managed that. Fewer still have made it look ceremonial. From this point onward, Venice was no longer simply a successful trading city. It was a thalassocracy, a power built on the sea, maintaining routes, stations, colonies, and naval strength across a wide watery zone from the Adriatic through the Aegean and into the Levant. The old phrase later associated with Venice, the Stato da Mar, the state of the sea, captures this well. It was not one continuous land empire where armies marched from province to province under a single horizon. It was a chain of maritime points, islands, ports, fortified harbors, commercial enclaves, and administrative footholds. Venice governed by holding hinges and choke points. It liked gateways. It liked places where ships had to stop, where contracts had to be signed, where customs dues could be levied, and where rival merchants could be reminded that the Republic had arrived first and brought a fleet. This was empire in a distinctly Venetian style, less a solid block than a net thrown over the sea. Crete is a particularly revealing example. Seized in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, it gave Venice a crucial base on the route toward the eastern Mediterranean. Grain, wine, sugar, wax, and strategic anchorage all mattered there. The island did not simply decorate Venetian maps. It sustained the Republic's maritime system. Yet Venice's rule overseas was not always serene. Colonial governance involved military control, settler elites, local resistance, tax extraction, and the sometimes awkward attempt to make distant places behave according to metropolitan needs. Venetian colonial officials could be efficient, legalistic, and utterly tiresome in ways recognizable to bureaucracies everywhere. Local populations sometimes rebelled, objected, negotiated, or endured. Venice liked to imagine its rule as orderly and rational. The ruled were occasionally less lyrical about the experience. Still, the wider system worked remarkably well. Venetian convoys sailed along structured routes. Merchant galleys operated on increasingly organized schedules. The Republic supported commerce through state-backed protection, regulation, and judicial frameworks. Ports under Venetian control or influence formed a chain of safe-ish movement in a dangerous sea. Safe-ish is an important pre-modern category. It means not safe exactly, but safer than the alternatives, and therefore profitable. If you were moving valuable cargo, you preferred routes where Venetian power could in theory retaliate against pirates, enforce agreements, and keep harbor arrangements from descending into improvisational chaos. This made Venice attractive to merchants and investors. It also gave the Republic leverage that went beyond the number of swords it could personally swing. At home, the city's governing institutions became still more elaborate. The Venetian genius was not invention in the abstract. It was sustained institutional adjustment. Power continued to be distributed among councils, magistrates, committees, and offices, so thickly layered that any outsider trying to understand the Constitution risked needing a nap halfway through. The Great Council grew in importance as the central body of the ruling class. The Senate handled foreign affairs and major policy. The Council of 40 had judicial functions. The Doge remained a dazzling symbol, ceremonially rich, heavily robed, and constrained on all sides. Venice did not trust single rulers with much unsupervised freedom. That mistrust would harden further over time. For a city built in mud, it developed an impressive allergy to personal monarchy. One of the famous turning points in this political evolution was the Serrata, or closing, of the Great Council in 1297. The exact process and implications were more gradual than the dramatic word suggests. But the outcome was clear enough. Political membership became increasingly restricted to a hereditary patriciate. In effect, the ruling class narrowed and formalized itself. Venice remained a republic, but now more openly a republic of noble families. This was not democracy drifting peacefully into exclusivity. It was oligarchy, admitting what it had always rather liked. Yet the Serrata also brought a certain stability. Access to office became defined through lineage, reducing some kinds of political contest while intensifying others inside the elite itself. The patricians could now spend generations competing for prestige, commands, marriages, and profits without having to worry too much about unpredictable newcomers barging into the club. It was socially rigid, politically conservative, and from the viewpoint of the established families, very sensible indeed. This hereditary aristocracy differed from many feudal nobilities elsewhere in Europe. Venetian patricians were merchants, administrators, diplomats, naval commanders, and office holders. Their status rested on state service as much as inherited land. Many invested heavily in trade. They were aristocrats who might argue about shipping contracts with quite serious faces. This mattered immensely. In other kingdoms, noble disdain for commerce could split political and economic power. In Venice, they reinforced each other. The same families who governed the Republic often had direct stakes in its convoys, taxes, colonial routes, and diplomatic privileges. The system had obvious opportunities for self-interest because it was almost entirely made of self-interest arranged into public form. But it also meant the ruling class had strong incentives to maintain order, defend trade, and think strategically across generations. Their own fortunes floated with the Republic's fortunes, sometimes literally. Rivalry with Genoa now became the defining drama of Venice's maritime ascent. Genoa, another formidable maritime republic, developed its own commercial network across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. It, too, built colonies, negotiated privileges, transported crusaders, financed ventures, and combined commerce with naval aggression. Where Venice leaned heavily toward the eastern Mediterranean and Adriatic system, Genoa proved especially strong in the western Mediterranean and later in the Black Sea world. Their interests overlapped often enough to make long periods of enmity unavoidable. This rivalry was not a single clean war with a poetic conclusion. It was a prolonged sequence of conflicts, treaties, naval battles, betrayals, recoveries, and renewed hostility. To say Venice and Genoa disliked each other is rather like saying storms are somewhat damp. The first major war between them broke out in the mid-13th century, and more followed. One especially famous episode came with the War of Chioggia, from 1378 to 1381, though by then the rivalry had been simmering and flaring for generations. Before reaching that crisis, it helps to understand why these two republics were such natural enemies. Both depended on maritime trade, both sought privileges in eastern ports. Both needed convoys, colonies, naval prestige, and access to profitable routes. Both cultivated flexible diplomacy and hard bargaining. Neither had much reason to trust the other. In a sea crowded with cargoes of silk, spice, grain, alum, slaves, and silver, every commercial advantage won by one seemed a theft from the other. They were too similar to coexist peacefully for long. The struggle after the restoration of Byzantine rule in Constantinople in 1261 sharpened this competition. When the Byzantine Empire was partially revived under Michael VIII, Palaiologos, Genoa secured major privileges through the Treaty of Nymphaeum. That threatened Venetian dominance in the eastern Mediterranean and in the revived imperial capital. Venice suddenly found that the world it had helped create after 1204 could shift underneath it. Maritime powers do not like unstable privileges. They prefer stable privileges ideally written by themselves. So rivalry resumed with intensity. Naval clashes took place in the Aegean, the Adriatic, and beyond. Merchant fleets became military fleets in inconveniently short order. Prisoners were taken. Fortunes vanished. Insurance calculations grew interesting. Venice learned again and again that mastery of the seas was not a trophy you won once and hung on a wall. It had to be contested every decade against rivals who also owned ships and ambition. The War of Chioggia is worth lingering over because it shows how close Venice came to ruin and how fiercely it recovered. Genoa, allied with other enemies of Venice, managed to strike deep into the Venetian lagoon system. In 1379, Genoese forces captured Chioggia, a town south of Venice itself. This was not some distant colony or minor embarrassment. It was a direct threat to the Republic's survival. For a moment, the seemingly invincible sea power looked vulnerable in its own backyard. Panic spread. Finances strained. The enemy had entered the waters that were supposed to be Venice's natural shield. The old comfort of lagoon defense suddenly looked less comforting, yet Venice responded with astonishing determination. Citizens and patricians alike contributed resources. The fleet was rebuilt and reorganized. Under commanders such as Vera Pisani, and with the relentless resolve of Doge Andrea Contarini, the Venetians trapped the Genoese at Chioggia and eventually forced surrender. The war ended with Venice battered but alive, and Genoa's long ability to challenge it decisively was broken. The significance of Chioggia goes beyond patriotic drama. It demonstrated several persistent Venetian strengths: communal mobilization in crisis, institutional flexibility, financial resilience, and refusal to accept final defeat while options remained. Venice was not the largest land power in Europe, It could not flood continents with cavalry, but when survival required coordination between government, fleet, money, and civic will, it often performed superbly. The victory also reinforced the myth of Venice as a chosen, enduring republic, a city preserved by its constitution, courage, and saintly protection. Every state tells flattering stories about its own crises. Venice was especially talented at telling them in mosaic. Naval and commercial power required infrastructure, and nowhere was that more spectacularly embodied than in the Venetian arsenal. Although its development was gradual from earlier dockyard traditions, by the late medieval and early modern periods, the arsenal was one of the wonders of Europe. A vast state-controlled shipbuilding and armaments complex capable of producing and outfitting fleets with startling efficiency. Foreign visitors later marveled that ships could seem to emerge there almost like bread from an oven, though admittedly larger and less suitable for breakfast. The arsenal symbolized Venice's ability to turn maritime strength into organized industry. Timber from mainland forests, rope, sailcloth, iron fittings, skilled labor, standardized parts, and administrative oversight all converged there. It was not just a dockyard. It was a military-industrial organism, centuries before anyone would have used such a phrase with a worried expression. The arsenal also reveals something fundamental about Venice's form of state power. The Republic excelled at blending public organization with private expertise. Shipwrights, caulkers, smiths, rope makers, carpenters, scribes, officers, and contractors operated within a framework that served state needs and commercial goals alike. A convoy system could be organized, war galleys could be mobilized, merchant shipping could draw on techniques and resources closely tied to the state. The Republic did not leave naval capacity to chance or purely private initiative. That level of coordination is one reason Venice remained formidable long after one might expect a city built on mud to have politely retired from greatness. At the same time, Venetian maritime dominance did not mean everyone else simply admired it and got out of the way. The Mediterranean remained crowded with competing powers. Genoa, Aragon, the Mamluks, the Byzantines, the papacy, various Italian states, local lords in Greece and the Aegean, and eventually the Ottoman Turks rising with calm menace. Venice operated through diplomacy as much as battle, often concluding treaties with Muslim rulers, negotiating access to ports, and adapting to changes with pragmatic speed. This flexibility sometimes made outside observers uneasy. A crusading sermon might denounce infidels in one setting, while Venetian merchants happily arranged commercial privileges in Alexandria or Damascus in another. Venice had a gift for being pious in public and practical at sea. One suspects the merchants slept better that way. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria was especially important, because the Levantine spice trade remained vital to Venetian wealth. Spices from Asia reached the eastern Mediterranean through complex Islamic trading networks before being redistributed westward. Venice did not sail to India in the medieval period. Instead, it inserted itself into the final, profitable stages of long chains that already existed. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other luxury goods fed European demand, and Venetian merchants became masters of this transfer economy. Their fortunes rose on other people's distances. That made relations with Mamluk rulers crucial. Even when papal policy or crusading rhetoric sought to restrict trade with Muslim powers, enforcement was complicated, and Venetian commercial appetite remained sturdy. Moral outrage is one thing, pepper prices are another. One reason Venice's story is so remarkable is that it managed to remain both local and global. The city was tiny in land area, socially compact, and politically centered on a limited number of families. Yet its horizon stretched from the Po Valley to the Black Sea, from English wool markets to Syrian ports, from alpine timber to Indian spices. Merchants, diplomats, clergy, sailors, and factors connected Venice to worlds far beyond the lagoon. Its notaries recorded deals involving places many Europeans would never see. Its warehouses stored goods from climates its winter fog could scarcely imagine. Its churches displayed spoils and styles from distant lands. Walking through Venice in its prime meant walking through concentrated geography, a marsh-born city stuffed with the world. As Venetian wealth expanded, so did its architecture and artistic culture. The Gothic palaces lining the Grand Canal, the lavish facade treatments, the decorative stonework, the ceremonial spaces of the Piazza San Marco, the paintings and altarpieces of later centuries, all emerged from long accumulations of trade, taxation, patronage, and imported materials. Venice looked rich because it was rich. But its beauty was not only a result of money, it was also shaped by the city's unusual environment. Buildings needed particular forms of foundation. Water reflections altered visual experience. Processions moved by boat as well as on foot. Public life took place in intimate relation with canals, quays, and light off the lagoon. Venice learned to turn physical improbability into aesthetic advantage. Where another city might have treated its environment as a nuisance, Venice made it part of the performance. The performance mattered. Venetian ceremonies were not decorative extras. They reinforced social order, political legitimacy, and civic myth. The annual ritual of the Sensa, the so-called marriage of the sea, celebrated Venice's dominion over the waters. The Doge, aboard the state barge Bucentoro, cast a ring into the Adriatic with solemn words of symbolic union. It was an extraordinary spectacle of power, piety, theater, and self-confidence. The Republic was effectively saying, not only do we survive on the sea, we are married to it, and we brought jewelry. Ritual, of course, does not make domination real by itself, but it helps persuade subjects, allies, rivals, and above all the rulers themselves that their position is natural, sacred, and enduring. States live partly on belief. Venice was excellent at staging belief with gold trim. Meanwhile, the Republic's intelligence and diplomatic systems became unusually sophisticated. Venice sent ambassadors widely and expected regular written reports. These dispatches offered detailed observations about foreign courts, military developments, economic conditions, and personalities. Over time, Venetian diplomatic reporting became famous for its thoroughness. Information was power, and the Republic cultivated it systematically. It also built internal security mechanisms. The Council of Ten, established after a failed conspiracy in 1310, grew into one of the most powerful bodies of the state, overseeing matters of security, intelligence, and political stability. Venice liked orderly government, and it liked threats to that order even less. The Council of Ten gained a reputation for secrecy and sternness. It was not a committee one hoped to join casually for the refreshments. This internal vigilance formed part of a broader Venetian obsession, preventing faction from turning the Republic into the kind of unstable Italian polity that made merchants nervous. Renaissance Italy was full of dazzling cities and alarming levels of conspiracy. Venice wanted the dazzling part without the routine stabbing. So it cultivated surveillance, legal restraint, controlled office rotation, and institutional balance. Ambitious individuals could rise, but only within the mesh of offices. Even the Doge, who looked wonderfully sovereign in portraits, was surrounded by restrictions. He could not correspond freely, could not travel without permission, could not act alone in many matters. And after death, his conduct could even be reviewed by inquisitors. Few positions in history have combined so much ceremony with so little opportunity to improvise. Yet Venice was not only an overseas power. From the late 14th and especially the 15th century onward, it began acquiring significant territories on the Italian mainland, the Terraferma. At first glance, this seems almost like betrayal of its own watery soul. Why would a sea republic bother with muddy inland provinces full of fortresses, tax registers, and peasants who stubbornly failed to appreciate maritime symbolism? The answer was strategic necessity. Mainland expansion helped secure food supplies, protect routes to alpine resources, defend against hostile neighbors, and provide depth against invasion. Control of cities such as Padua, Verona, Vicenza, Brescia, and Bergamo over time gave Venice a buffer and resource base. The republic that once fled mainland violence now ruled large stretches of mainland territory. History does enjoy irony when it has enough centuries to prepare it. The Terraferma also changed Venice's character. It became both sea empire and territorial state. That brought benefits, but also tensions. Governing inland subjects required different administrative habits than managing island colonies and ports. Mainland wars involved armies, fortifications, and diplomacy with major Italian and European powers. Venetian patricians had to think not only about convoys and spice prices, but also about harvests, road systems, and border defenses against Milan or the Empire. Still, the Republic managed this dual identity surprisingly well for a long time. It retained maritime focus while building a stable mainland domain that fed its economy and protected its lagoon heartland. One could say Venice had decided, after centuries of watery specialization, to acquire a safety blanket made of provinces. The 15th century marked one of the high points of Venetian power, wealth, and cultural brilliance. The city dominated much of the Adriatic, held extensive overseas possessions, ruled a substantial mainland state, and remained one of Europe's greatest commercial centers. Its currency, the gold ducat, enjoyed exceptional trust and circulation. Its merchants, bankers, ship owners, artisans, and officials operated within a stable legal framework that made large-scale commerce possible. Venetian glassmakers on Murano became famous. Textile production, book trade, metalwork, luxury crafts, and financial services all flourished. The Republic's image across Europe was one of glittering prosperity, disciplined governance, and enviable continuity. Other states might boast ancient lineage or feudal armies. Venice could point to functioning institutions and actual cash flow, which is often more persuasive. And yet, at the very height of its power, new shadows approached. Chief among them was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks expanded steadily in the Balkans and eastern Mediterranean, consuming territories, reducing Byzantium to fragments, and eventually capturing Constantinople in 1453. For Venice, this was both catastrophe and opportunity of a grim kind. The Byzantine remnant, long weakened, finally disappeared. A new and formidable imperial power, now controlled strategic routes and former Venetian spheres of operation. At the same time, Venice was practical enough to negotiate with the Ottomans when possible. War and trade alternated. Treaties restored commercial privileges after conflicts. Venetian merchants continued to operate in Ottoman lands, but the balance had changed. Venice was no longer expanding into a fractured Eastern world. It faced a centralized, militarily potent empire that also understood maritime and commercial strategy. The seas had acquired a new master with very definite opinions. The wars between Venice and the Ottomans stretched across centuries and consumed enormous resources. Venice lost and regained territories. It defended islands, fortified ports, and struggled to preserve routes that had once seemed secure. The loss of Negroponte in 1470 was a major blow. Cyprus, acquired in the late 15th century through dynastic circumstances and Venetian maneuvering, became another key possession, but was eventually conquered by the Ottomans in 1570–71. Crete, long a Venetian bastion, held out until the 17th century before falling after a devastatingly prolonged war. These were not minor colonial adjustments. They represented the gradual erosion of Venice's Eastern Empire under the pressure of a rival capable of sustained military projection. The Republic remained skilled, wealthy, and stubborn, but the strategic tide was shifting. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 often appears in popular memory as a triumphant turning point for Christian Europe, and Venice played a crucial role in the Holy League fleet that defeated the Ottomans there. The battle mattered symbolically and psychologically, and it was indeed a major naval victory. Yet it did not reverse the long-term strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean in any simple way. Cyprus was lost. Ottoman power endured. Venice continued to negotiate, trade, and fight as circumstances required. Lepanto was glorious, loud, and well-suited to paintings. History, however, is often decided by logistics, taxation, attrition, and geopolitics that are much less photogenic. Venice understood this, which is why it signed peace when it needed to, even after heroic victories. It preferred survival to dramatic last stands, a habit which partly explains why it survived so long. Another, even more profound challenge came from beyond the Mediterranean altogether. The opening of Atlantic routes and the Portuguese sea route to India around Africa. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in 1498, a slow but enormous shift began. Venice's traditional strength lay in controlling the European end of Eastern luxury trade that moved through Levantine and Egyptian intermediaries. If spices and other goods could increasingly come via Atlantic maritime networks under Portuguese control, Venice's central role in that system would weaken. This change was not instantaneous. Venetian trade remained important for a long time, and the Mediterranean did not suddenly become irrelevant. But the structure of global commerce was expanding in directions that bypassed the Adriatic. Venice, master of one sea, now faced a world where the main stage was moving to oceans it had never been built to command. This is one of the gently tragic aspects of Venetian history. The Republic had mastered the environment that gave birth to it. It had turned lagoon refuge into Mediterranean supremacy. It had built institutions, fleets, colonies, rituals, and wealth around a sea-centered world. And then world history widened. Atlantic empires, transoceanic trade, and the rise of new powers shifted the axis of commerce. Venice was still impressive, still cultured, still rich by many standards, but the terms of greatness were changing. Its genius had been perfectly suited to one historical geography. It was less suited to another. There is something almost unfair about this, though history is not known for its sympathy toward business models. Even so, Venice did not simply collapse into irrelevance. The Republic adapted in many ways. It remained an important manufacturing and trading center. It invested in mainland agriculture. It continued to function as a diplomatic player. Its artistic and cultural life blossomed spectacularly during the Renaissance. Painters such as Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese transformed Venetian visual culture into something radiant, sensuous, and unmistakable. The city became a center of printing as well, with Aldus Manutius and the Aldine Press revolutionizing humanist publishing. Music, theater, ceremonial display, and luxury crafts thrived. Even if the Republic's relative strategic position declined, its cultural influence remained immense. Venice might no longer rule quite as many seas, but it could still teach Europe how to paint velvet and print Greek texts. Printing is a surprisingly good lens on the Republic's resilience. Venice became one of the great publishing centers of Europe in the late 15th and 16th centuries because it combined commercial infrastructure, cosmopolitan networks, skilled labor, relative political stability, and access to markets. Books, like spices, benefited from ports, credit, law, and distribution. The same city that had once transformed salt and silk into power could also turn paper and type into profit. Its presses disseminated classical texts, devotional works, maps, legal manuals, and vernacular literature across the continent. The lagoon had become not only a warehouse of goods, but a warehouse of ideas. One suspects the early refugees from Lombard violence would have been astonished to hear that their muddy shelter would someday help standardize italic type. Daily life in Venice during its mature centuries was as varied and layered as in any major urban center, though always marked by the city's peculiar environment. Nobles lived in palaces overlooking canals, but those palaces rested on piles driven into soft ground and depended on supplies hauled through watery streets. Artisans worked in specialized districts. Fishermen still harvested the lagoon. Gondoliers moved people and goods. Sailors came and went from the arsenal and merchant fleets. Foreign merchants occupied fondacci and quarters with their own customs, languages, and regulations. Jews, after 1516, were restricted to the ghetto, yet remained vital to the city's economic and social life. Prostitutes, priests, patricians, pilgrims, printers, courtesans, clerks, and laborers all moved through the same shimmering urban fabric. Venice looked like a fantasy from a distance. Up close, it smelled more like a functioning city, which is to say of trade, humanity, and canal water occasionally expressing itself. The Venetian patriciate, for all its grandeur, also lived under peculiar pressures. Noble families needed wealth to sustain status, marriages, offices, and public display. Commercial risk, dowries, political competition, and demographic fluctuation could strengthen some houses and ruin others. Because the ruling class was closed, noble identity mattered intensely. Yet not every noble was equally rich, and some became surprisingly impoverished while still clinging to hereditary dignity with admirable stubbornness. Venice, in this sense, was not a simple elite paradise. It was a machine that rewarded successful service and investment, but could also expose nobles to debt, frustration, and the horror of appearing less splendid than their cousins during a public festival. The Republic's famed morality was similarly mixed. Venetian officials liked to present the state as orderly, just, pious, and rational. Sometimes it was. It also tolerated and regulated vice in ways that were practical rather than puritanical. Courtesans became notable figures in the city's social world. Gambling, sexual commerce, carnival inversions, masked encounters, and theatrical pleasures all formed part of Venetian culture. Carnival especially turned the city into a stage where hierarchy could be disguised without truly disappearing. Masks allowed anonymity, flirtation, satire, and controlled disorder. Venice understood that social pressure sometimes needed ritualized release. If a republic is going to be ruled by committees and hereditary patricians, it may as well occasionally allow everyone to wear masks and behave with decorative irresponsibility. Disease, however, remained one of the great correctives to civic glamour. Like all pre-modern cities engaged in wide trade networks, Venice was vulnerable to plague. The Black Death in the 14th century devastated the city as it did much of Europe. Later outbreaks repeatedly returned. Dense urban living, maritime connections, and constant movement made Venice susceptible. Yet the Republic also became a pioneer in public health measures. It established quarantine practices, lazarettos on islands for isolating ships and suspected cases, and administrative systems for disease control. Even here, the Venetian style appears clearly: organized, maritime, bureaucratic, and unsentimental. If plague threatened trade and population, then plague must be regulated. It was difficult work, often insufficient, but historically important. Venice helped develop the language and practice of quarantine precisely because it could not afford to let every arriving ship bring both pepper and pestilence uninspected. Public health policy also reveals the Republic's broader willingness to subordinate private preference to state interest when necessary. Ships could be detained, persons could be isolated, information could be gathered, magistrates could impose rules. Venice valued liberty in certain civic and economic forms, but it was never libertarian in the modern sense. It expected regulation, especially where the common welfare of the Republic or the profits of the Republic, often delightfully aligned, were concerned. This did not make it uniquely harsh by pre-modern standards. It made it effective in a way many states struggled to match. Venice repeatedly demonstrated that a government can be both oligarchic and administratively competent, which must have been very annoying for critics hoping it would conveniently self-destruct. Religion in Venice retained its distinctive civic coloring into the Renaissance and beyond. The Republic often clashed with papal claims when they threatened Venetian autonomy. One famous conflict came in the early 17th century during the Interdict Crisis, when Pope Paul V attempted to punish Venice over jurisdictional disputes. The Republic resisted, supported by thinkers such as Paolo Sarpi, and largely preserved its independence of action. Venice was Catholic, yes, but Venetian first. This formula ran through centuries of policy. Saints, relics, processions, churches, and piety all adorned the Republic, yet none of them entitled outside powers to command it easily. Few states wore religion more publicly, while surrendering less control to clerical ambition. By the 17th century, the long arc of Venetian maritime dominance was unmistakably bending downward, though not snapping. Wars with the Ottomans drained resources. The fall of Crete in 1669, after a siege of epic duration, marked the loss of one of Venice's greatest overseas possessions. The Republic fought on, even recovering the Morea for a time in the late 17th century before losing it again. These campaigns show both decline and persistence. Venice no longer possessed the decisive initiative of its earlier centuries, yet it remained capable of astonishing military effort when prestige and survival demanded. It had become an old sea power, elegant and dangerous in flashes, like an aging admiral who still knows exactly where the guns are. Economically, too, Venice adjusted rather than disappearing. Its role in luxury production, regional trade, finance, and agriculture on the mainland continued. Tourism in the modern sense did not yet exist, but elite visitors, diplomats, artists, and travelers were drawn to the city's beauty, ceremonies, and reputation. By the 18th century, Venice had become for many outsiders a place of decadence, pleasure, and fading splendor. Canals, music, carnival, opera, gambling, masks, and aristocratic ease colored foreign imagination. There was truth in this, but also distortion. Venice remained a functioning state. It still governed territories, administered laws, taxed subjects, and maintained institutions. Decline does not always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like a government still paying officials while painters continue producing masterpieces and foreigners remark that the parties are excellent. The final end of the Venetian Republic came not from a slow sinking into the lagoon, as poetic metaphor might prefer, but from Napoleon. In 1797, during the upheavals of the French Revolutionary Wars, the ancient republic, unable to resist the military and geopolitical pressures of the age, surrendered. The last doge, Ludovico Manin, abdicated. Soon Venice was handed over to Austria under the Treaty of Campo Formio. A political system that had lasted for roughly 1,000 years came to an end with startling abruptness. The republic that had survived Lombards, Franks, Genoese, emperors, popes, crusades, plagues, and Ottoman wars finally fell before the age of mass continental armies and revolutionary statecraft. The sea-born oligarchy could manage treaties, convoys, and councils magnificently. It was less prepared for Napoleon arriving with modern force and very little reverence for antique constitutional charm. And yet, even after the Republic died, the achievement remained. That is the part worth lingering over in the dark, quiet mood of this story. Venice did something almost absurd. It began as a set of communities clustered in a lagoon because the mainland had become too dangerous. People fled there not because it was ideal, but because it was difficult. Mud, tides, reeds, shallow channels, unstable ground, mosquitoes, and damp inconvenience formed the background. Survival required adaptation. Adaptation produced maritime habits. Maritime habits produced commerce. Commerce supported institutions. Institutions protected stability. Stability attracted wealth. Wealth built fleets. Fleets defended routes. Routes sustained empire. Empire adorned itself with saints, mosaics, palaces, rituals, and law. Over centuries, the refugees' hideout became one of the most sophisticated republics in history, and for a long time, one of the true masters of the seas. It is worth pausing on how non-obvious this was. Many cities are well placed by geography in obvious ways. They sit on fertile plains, broad rivers, safe harbors, or crossroads that practically beg for greatness. Venice sat in a lagoon where even building a stable doorstep required ingenuity. Fresh water was an issue. Land was scarce and unstable. Transport depended on careful navigation. The environment was defensive, yes, but also difficult. Greatness there had to be made and remade and maintained. Timber piles had to be driven. Channels had to be known. Trade had to be cultivated. Institutions had to be stable enough that investors believed in tomorrow. A less disciplined people might have remained an archipelago of modest fishing villages, complaining about the weather. The Venetians chose a different path. They built a global reputation out of inconvenience. Their success also depended on an unusual civic psychology. Venice, for all its magnificence, remained marked by caution. The Republic distrusted sudden concentration of power. It valued continuity, records, procedure, and balance. Its ruling class could be greedy, vain, or ruthless, but it was rarely careless about institutional survival. Venetian politics lacked some of the flamboyant individualism found in princely courts elsewhere. No Venetian equivalent of a Renaissance despot strode dramatically through history, overturning everything by personality alone. Instead, one sees councils, committees, magistrates, elections among the eligible, elaborate constitutional mechanisms, and a ruling elite trained to think in terms of the state's long life. That can sound dull beside the biographies of warrior kings. It was also extraordinarily effective. Venice proves that paperwork, if sufficiently armed, can become majestic. The sea itself shaped Venetian mentality in ways deeper than commerce. Maritime life teaches a kind of realism. Weather changes, routes matter, supplies matter, timing matters, overconfidence kills, reputation counts. So do contracts. A ship may be beautiful, but if it leaks, beauty becomes secondary very quickly. Venice brought this practicality into politics. It could be imaginative in ambition, but sober in execution. It rarely pursued ideological purity when profit and security suggested compromise. It negotiated with Muslims, fought Christians, allied with former enemies, and changed course when required. This adaptability often offended idealists. It also kept the Republic alive. One is tempted to say Venice was cynical, but perhaps that is unfair. It simply understood that the sea does not reward wishful thinking. The city's physical beauty can sometimes obscure the hardness beneath it. Behind every marble palace stood generations of laborers, sailors, rowers, builders, enslaved persons, craftsmen, and clerks. Behind St. Mark's glowing mosaics stood commerce, appropriation, and state propaganda. Behind the romance of gondolas stood a port system, an empire, and a social order that was not designed primarily for equality. The poor of Venice did not necessarily feel they were living inside a masterpiece. The colonies did not always experience Venetian governance as benevolent refinement. The Republic was brilliant, but like most brilliant states, it exacted costs from many, while rewarding the few who learned its rules best. Sleepy history should still be honest history, even when the moonlight on the canal is doing its best to distract us. And yet, honesty also requires admiration. The administrative sophistication of Venice was real. Its diplomatic intelligence was real. Its maritime organization was real. Its ability to survive for centuries between larger and more powerful empires was real. So was the cultural civilization it produced. Architecture suspended between East and West. Paintings drenched in color. Printing houses that spread learning. public rituals of extraordinary theatrical force, urban forms unmatched anywhere else in Europe. Venice was not only successful, it was distinctive. Its rise altered the Mediterranean. Its methods influenced trade, diplomacy, public health, and statecraft. Even in decline, it remained singular enough that generations of outsiders half fell in love with it and then wrote anxious books about decadence. There is also something deeply human in the Venetian story because it begins with fear. Not with manifest destiny, not with prophecy, not with a chosen empire descending fully formed from the clouds, but with people trying to escape violence. They moved into a difficult place because the usual places had become unsafe. They improvised, they adapted, they made do. Then they traded, then they governed, then they fortified, then they expanded. This is not a neat moral tale. Venice became powerful and often predatory in its turn. But the origin remains striking. One of the great maritime republics of history began as a refuge. That alone gives its grandeur a slightly different emotional color from hereditary monarchies founded on conquest. Venice conquered plenty later, but first it hid. Perhaps that is why the city was so committed to memory and myth. It needed stories equal to its improbability. Hence St. Mark arriving by providential theft. Hence the marriage to the sea. Hence the lion banner, the ceremonial doge, the sense that Venice was somehow protected and destined despite the plain evidence that it stood in salt water because frightened people once had nowhere better to go. The myths were not false in the simple sense. They translated historical experience into civic meaning. A people who had built magnificence from insecurity wanted to believe magnificence was deserved. This is understandable. Most states, if given the chance, wrap their luck in velvet and call it virtue. If we step back very quietly, the whole arc becomes visible. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the lagoon offered shelter from collapsing imperial order and invasion. In the early Middle Ages, Byzantine ties gave structure, legitimacy, and access to wider trade. Local leadership grew into republican institutions. Maritime commerce expanded across the Adriatic and Levant. St. Mark provided sacred identity. Privileges from emperors and treaties enriched merchants. Naval organization protected convoys. The Fourth Crusade transformed Venice into an imperial sea power. Rivalry with Genoa sharpened its strength. The arsenal industrialized maritime capacity. Mainland acquisition secured resources and buffers. Ottoman expansion and Atlantic routes gradually limited Venetian supremacy. Yet the city endured, glorious and stubborn, until modern geopolitics finally dissolved the ancient republic. It is one of the cleanest examples in history of long-term compounding. Mud became money. Money became fleets. Fleets became empire. Empire became culture. And culture became immortality of a sort. That immortality is still visible, though the republic is gone. The canals remain. St. Mark's still glows. The palaces still face the water with that peculiar Venetian confidence, as if soft ground were merely a detail to be managed by competent ancestors. Tourists now arrive instead of spice convoys. And the city's great anxiety is often too many visitors rather than Frankish cavalry or Genoese fleets. This is, on balance, a better problem, though perhaps not to the locals on certain afternoons. But beneath modern Venice, physically and historically, lie the driven piles of earlier centuries, and beneath those piles lies the memory of refuge. The city still floats on its beginning. So when we ask how Venice rose from refugees to masters of the seas, the answer is not magic, though from a distance it can look suspiciously like it. The answer is geography used intelligently, trade pursued relentlessly, institutions built patiently, symbols deployed brilliantly, and risks managed with a mariner's realism. It is the story of people who turned a defensive landscape into an engine of exchange. It is the story of a ruling class that understood commerce could be noble if it was profitable enough. It is the story of a republic that distrusted kings, loved committees, and armed its paperwork with galleys. It is the story of a city that learned the sea's mood so well that for a few breathtaking centuries it seemed less a passenger on history than its pilot. And perhaps the most Venetian lesson of all is this: power does not always begin where it looks grandest. Sometimes it begins where survival forces precision. Sometimes the best fortification is inconvenience. Sometimes the people who win are the ones who learn how to move through difficult water while everyone else is still trying to keep their boots dry. Venice never forgot the value of awkward geography. It made enemies hesitate, merchants depend, and states negotiate. From the reeds and marshes of the lagoon emerged a polity so durable that monarchies came and went, while the doges kept processing beneath the mosaics. It took a revolutionary age to finally stop the procession. Now the lagoon is quiet again. The tide moves under black water. Somewhere in the distance one can